do this.
Okay.
All right, now it's my great pleasure to introduce Franjo Weissing, who will kick us off in the 2023 LEX seminar series. Franjo, the floor is yours.
Okay, no, thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to present some of my work here in this seminar series. Now, as you all know, this is the 50th anniversary of the paper of Maynard Smith and Price, The Logic of Animal Conflict, which they published in Nature in 1973, which marks, in a sense, the starting point of evolutionary game theory. And last year, we had the 40th anniversary of this fundamental book by Maynard Smith on the evolution and the theory of games. And I don't have to say much about the success of evolutionary game theory in the biological sciences. Now, when I now start giving my lectures on this field and I ask around, so most of the students already at bachelor stage, they know the hawk-dove game from school. They also know the prisoner's dilemma game from school. And many of them have already even heard about snowdrift game or stack hunt game and so on. So it's really a field that has been quite successful in even trickling down into high school curricula. Now, if you look more at the professional area, then the games considered are not as simple as this hawk-dove game or the prisoner's dilemma game, which are mainly something like building blocks. But if you look at something like models for real-world examples, then they typically are much, much more involved, having many more strategies. Here's, for example, an example by Selton in 1983, where he said this is a simple game for animal fighting behavior, but you have to realize that here also are new building blocks that are sprouting from this part of this game tree. And this is something that was relatively popular in the 1980s and 1990s, that people investigated more and more and more sophisticated versions of old games that had been investigated before. This was also an area where you could really make a living by really learning the methods of analyzing these games. However, two of the most prominent people in this field, John McNamara and Alistair Houston from Bristol University, who had done a lot in making these more sophisticated models popular, and mainly they worked in areas like dynamic programming. So they, when looking back at what they had done in a fundamental and very influential paper in 2009 in Transient Ecology and Evolution, so the name of the paper is Integrating Function and Mechanism, they in a sense said, now when we look back, we actually have the idea that we ended up in something like a dead-end road. In the past, we and other behavioral ecologists, they have built complex models of optimal behavior in very simple environments. But if you think a little bit more about it, that's what they say. They say very clearly in this article, so that we should better change our focus, and we should then focus not that much on complex models in simple environments, but we should focus on simple mechanisms that perform well in complex environments. That's actually what also my group tries to do, and we have then made quite a number of steps in developing simple mechanisms or simple mechanistic view of evolutionary game theory. And in this talk, I would like to tell you a little bit about our first steps that we have been taking and some insights that we have obtained until now. And I would like to very briefly talk about 4 different case studies that all have somewhat different kind of take-home message and all together, in a sense, illustrate what a difference such a modeling style based on simple mechanistic models then would make. And let me start by a model for the evolution of helping behavior. So this was a paper that came out in the proceeding in the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society in 2016, and it was first author was a former PhD student, Andrés Quiñones, and we did it together with my colleagues Sander van Doorn, Ido Penn, and Michael Taborski. And it's a relatively simple model on the evolution of helping behavior. And basically everything started with a biological example. And this example are so-called cooperative cichlids that had been studied by Michael Taborski and colleagues for more than a decade until then. So these cichlids, they form groups and of something like between 10 and 20 individuals typically. And these groups, they contain only one breeding pair, and all the other members, all the other fish on the large territory, they basically just are staying there, and most of them are also helping to defend the territory, or to clean the eggs, or to build the nest and things like that. So they are more or less considered as helpers of the breeding pair. One interesting thing is that was looking very strange to Michael Taborski was that many, if not most, of the helpers on the territory are not really related to the breeding pair. So there's not, so apparently it was not, all the helping is not only explainable by kin selection. The second interesting thing is that if you compare the helping level of the related helpers with those of the unrelated helpers, then it turned out that the unrelated individuals helped more than the related ones, which was also quite interesting. The third thing is that there is hardly any aggression visible in these groups. However, if the experimentators prevented one of the individuals to help for a while, for example, for catching it away for a while, now then actually what happened was that the breeding pair, or particularly the male, really behaved very aggressively against the individual that did not help. And the question never was, can we come up with a model that explains these various kinds of things? Now, the model is not really, the type of model is not very novel. Basically, we made the assumptions so that the subordinates, so the potential helpers, so that they actually, it's in their interest to stay in the territory of dominance. And the reason being that on a territory with a group of fish, it's much safer than to stay more out in the open on your own. But then on the other hand, the idea was that that just staying on the territory without helping imposes fitness costs for the dominance. And therefore, the idea is then that the subordinates, when they do not help, that they elicit aggression, and that they can only appease the breeding individuals, the dominant individual, by helping. And this kind of model is called the pay-to-stay model. In a sense, the idea is that the subordinates, they have to pay by helping in order to get the permission to stay in the territory. And basically, the only thing that was different in our model is the way how we then modeled the situation. And basically, we made a relatively somewhat simpler model that is typically considered in the literature. So first of all, we considered this is the dominant individual, and we looked at the aggression level of the dominant, and we looked at the helping level of the subordinate. And the idea is that in both cases, the behavior of both individuals is more or less governed by what one calls behavioral norm of reaction. So basically, this is the behavioral norm of reaction of the dominant, meaning that it basically adapts the aggression level that it has against the subordinate to the helping level of the subordinate. So in this particular example that I show here, a dominant individual would be highly aggressive against a non-helper and not aggressive at all towards a helper. And we also assume here for the subordinates that the subordinates also have something like a behavioral norm of reaction. And in this particular case, so this blue curve then indicates that in the absence of aggression, it would not help. But if it is confronted with a lot of aggression by the dominant, now then it would basically then decide to help. Now, these, of course, these in a sense are the strategies that are available to the different fish, and they are evolvable properties. And in our case, and that's basically what I mean by simple behavioral strategies. So these are simple behavioral strategies that are governed by 3 different parameters. So we modeled this as a logistic function with 3 parameters: the maximal level of aggression, and then 2 parameters, alpha and beta, that tells us whether this function is decreasing or increasing, and where the turning point is and how steep the decline or increase at the turning point is. And the same here for the helper. We also assume that this blue curve is subject to evolution, and that here there are 3 parameters, H max, gamma, and delta, which are then evolving properties, which more or less then lead to the evolution of the strategy of the subordinate. And both of these are jointly evolving. Now, one final piece of information that I have to give you is what actually will then happen. So if different individuals in the population have different reaction norms, but assume now that this reaction norm meets this particular reaction norm, then basically what will happen is, that's basically our assumption then in the model, that the subordinate starts with any kind of helping level, and this will elicit a certain aggression level. And then given this aggression level, the subordinate will adapt then its helping level. This will indeed lead to the adaptation of the aggression level, and so on, until in the end, the system then more or less zooms into an equilibrium point, which of course only exists and is stable under certain conditions, but for all reasonable strategies that we considered, this was always the case. And then, of course, what we can then look, how will the system then evolve? And we do it here by means of individual-based simulations, but actually you can also choose an analytical approach. I will say a few words about this at the end. Now, basically, what we did, we ran quite a number of evolutionary simulations, so hundreds of them. Probably in the meantime, more than 1,000 or so simulations have been run. And actually, in all of these cases, we started the population in a situation where there was no aggression at all and no helping at all. And so this was the initial condition. But then you see that very rapidly aggression goes up, and then it stays at the high level. And then there's a certain point where the system then changes and switches to a completely new type of situation, which is given by this endpoint. All this is very interesting, and I can talk quite a while about what's actually going on here. But for us, the most important point at this moment is that in all the simulations that we have run, we always at the end ended up in norms of reactions that looked like this, where on the one hand, this fat line shows the average in the population for the subordinates and for the dominants, but you also see these light lines, which also indicate the variation in the population. So you see there's quite some variation in norms of reactions that remains there in the population indefinitely. So even if you would look, so this is then, for example, at 0.5, even if you would look then very much in the future, we'll always get quite some variation in the reaction norms. But the important thing is here, that is what you see in the end, is you get a situation where then there's quite a high level of helping and a very low level of aggression that has evolved in this case. So in other words, the first conclusion more for the biologists is that efficient cooperation among unrelated individuals can evolve via the evolution of these negotiation strategies, as we call them. And basically, helping behavior is enforced by the dominant's willingness to punish lazy helpers. But actually, this is not really necessary, because the helpers the subordinates do already help before aggression actually gets off the ground. So it's something that we call them preemptive appeasement. But now the interesting thing for my colleagues from biology is now what happens if the participants are related? So if they're kin to each other. In this situation, here you see actually what happens if the relatedness is 0, as I just indicated until now. In this case, you see 50 different simulations. And this is something like, for each of these 50 simulations, you get then the average helping level and the average aggression level at the equilibrium that you see. And you see that they do not really get to exactly the same point. You get a variation across different kinds of simulations, but all form a relatively dense cloud of points. And for this particular case, we have run even many more simulations, and we could then enlarge this cloud of points. And here we have, here you see then two other simulations where we have then the same kind of thing running then for individuals where the subordinate is then related to the dominant. And I cannot see it in my screen because it is covered. Let me see, this is in B, it is related to this level is 0.25. And in C, the related level is then 0.50. And there's something interesting. What you see is, on the one hand, you see again that there is some of the simulations still end up in this negotiation equilibrium, as I call it, and here as well. But what you also see is that some additional equilibrium shows up, namely in the case of R is 0.25. 8 of the simulations end up here. In the case of R is 0.5, 26 of the simulations end up there, which is a very different kind of behavior. Namely, this is the behavior where the aggression level is not depending at all on the level of helping, and where then a level of helping is actually then achieved that is not responding to the level of aggressiveness. And we interpret this as something like a kin-selected equilibrium point, whereas this is the negotiation-induced kind of equilibrium point. And as you see, that in the case of interactions with related individuals, any of these two kind of equilibria can actually be then achieved. The interesting thing about this is that if you compare the two different kinds of equilibria, then you see that the helping level in the negotiation equilibrium is actually much higher than in the kin-selected equilibrium. So basically, what you see here is that without relatedness, you actually get a higher degree of helping than in the presence of kin selection. And that's basically the second take-home message more for my colleagues from biology. Basically, the first thing is that the negotiation equilibrium that is then based on responsive strategies is more efficient than the kin-selected equilibrium, which is then based on unconditional helping, so not elicited by aggression. And so in that sense, and the second important thing is that high relatedness makes it more difficult to evolve the most efficient negotiation outcome, because you very easily end up at the kin-selected equilibrium in this particular case. And this is something. This is something that is already part of the so-called Ricardo's principle. It's a very old economic principle that more or less explains also why negotiation then is typically more efficient if the two interaction partners are not too much aligned in their interests. So that's basically Ricardo's principle more or less says, so that that in case that the interaction partners in negotiations have somewhat adverse kind of interest, that this often leads to a more efficient outcome than if their interests overlap to a large extent. In case of relatedness, more or less, you could say inclusive fitness, whatever this may be in this moment, I don't want to say too much about it, more or less aligns the interests, or the relatedness aligns the interests of the dominant and the subordinate to a certain extent. And that's maybe the reason why then kin-selected outcomes are often less efficient than negotiation outcomes. This is not only the only model that shows this, but there are many other models around in the meantime that show exactly the same kind of principle. So in that sense, kin selection hampers rather than facilitates the evolution of efficient cooperation. So that was the first case study that I wanted to show. Now, for us now, the point is not that much what happens to helping, and is kin selection more efficient than or less efficient than responsive strategies and so on. For us, the interesting thing is now to what extent does the modeling style based on simple strategies, to what extent does this have an effect on the solutions or on the outcomes that we see? Now, already indicated, so in this case, we always run simulations in order to really see how the equilibria are approached and which equilibria are approached and things like that. So I'm very fond of running individual-based simulations. But on the other hand, we have a relatively simple strategy space in case of both participants. So we can also actually do some analytical work on it and can then see to what extent then the analysis of the 3-parameter strategies, families of strategies that we have, lead to the same conclusions that we find in the simulations. And that's what we have done. And Andrés Quiñones, our PhD student, has written a chapter of his thesis on this. And basically, this analysis confirms the main conclusion of the simulations. There are 2 different kinds of equilibria. If there's no relatedness, there's only one equilibrium, the negotiation equilibrium that I showed to you. If above a certain threshold value of relatedness, you can see that there are 2 equilibria, one with unconditional helping that corresponds to the other one that I showed to you. And it also confirms then that the negotiation equilibrium is more efficient than the kin selection equilibrium. But this is basically given the strategies set that we looked at. The problem is that if we really would look at very sophisticated negotiation strategies, we looked at very simple ones that were guided there with smooth behavioral response of selection, norms of reaction, which to a biologist looks very plausible and already a relatively complicated model. But to a game theorist, they look then, in a sense, very almost ridiculously simple for characterizing a negotiation game. And that's something that we also looked a little bit into this. I will not show any results about it, but what it turns out is that when you enlarge the strategy space and consider more complex negotiation strategies, now then basically what you find is that many additional equilibria show up. You do not only get 2 of them, a kin-selected one and a non-kin-selected one, but you actually easily get first hundreds, and then you get thousands of different equilibrium points. And if you run simulations with more complex strategies, then you get a rather fuzzy outcome, and simulations often end up in a quite inefficient equilibrium, because there are so many different equilibria around, and it's very difficult to get from one to the next one. So from this perspective, one might say, the simple strategy reasoning is more or less simplifies the world quite a bit. But on the other hand, you might also say, from a more mathematical point of view, now it's actually somewhat cheating, because if you really would look at the highly sophisticated strategies, you would get quite a different outcome. The biologist, on the other hand, would say, yes, you game theorist, you can come and look at the very complicated and sophisticated kind of strategies. But is it really realistic to assume that that animals are so fine-tuned to a kind of a specific kind of game situation that they are able to play these sophisticated strategies? Wouldn't you then need something like 20, 30, 40 gene loci to induce to basically induce this kind of behavior? And if you have then something like hundreds of different behaviors, wouldn't this then not mean that you would then use something like tens of thousands of gene loci just for encoding your behavior? While, as we know, even the humans have not many more than 20,000 genes in total. So that's basically one of the part of the reasoning that is going on in the biological community on this. But it's perhaps also food for thought a little bit for the game theorists who are not working then on specific kinds of models.
Franjo?
Yeah.
Excuse me, do you take questions during the talk, or would you like them?
Now would be a good moment, because then I will go to the next case study, but this would be a good moment to ask questions.
All right, excellent. So there are some people with raised hands, and I've seen some questions.
Okay, yes, let me see whether I
so.
can see them. So I see something is, okay, is aggression costless to the aggressor? No, it's indeed, it's also, there are some costs involved, indeed, yes. Yeah. And so it's so aggression is mainly costly to the helper, but it's also a costly act for the aggressor itself. Yes.
And Matthias, you had a raised hand.
Yeah.
Yes. So if I understand, did you the simple set of strategies, you require them to be continuous?
Yes, they are. They're basically simple. With simpler mind, I mean, these are this kind of logistic strategies that are given. Let me see whether I can easily go back. Here it is. So basically, simple strategies. You have only, they are given then by a 3-parameter family of curves, as you would say as a mathematician. So you have only. So they have to be they are all automatically either monotonically decreasing or monotonically increasing. So they can be more or less constant in principle. The beta tells you something about the slope of it. The beta is negative, the slope is here negative, the beta is positive, it goes up and so on. So it can have different shapes, but it is quite restricted.
Okay, so it's not just continuity, because
no, it's not just
super reasonable, right?
It's actually, we assume that all the strategies are governed, are really quite constrained in that sense. So basically, how we implement it in simulations, each individual has 6 gene loci, one for the Amax, one for the Hmax, one for the alpha, the beta, the gamma, and the delta. And then successful individuals produce more offspring, and therefore transmit then more of the strategies than to more of the offspring. But there are also then some mutations with small effect size that change the Imax, the alpha, beta, and so on. It can change them when a mutation occurs. Yeah.
No, I get that, but so my question is, it's not that you, in order to get this multiplicity, do you have to make very weird, very rich strategy sets? Do you have to give up differentiability?
Yeah.
Because
this is really one of the interesting things. So these more sophisticated games. So that's what I learned from my supervisor, and I think that most people really do not know this. So my supervisor Zelton, he won the Nobel Prize together with Nash, just because he was very much interested in more complicated kinds of interactions, like these negotiation games. And basically, what you see there is that there is a huge number of Nash equilibria, first of all, but also if you later then make evolutionary models out of it, you find then a large number of evolutionarily stable strategies. And this is something that was actually the reason why he got the Nobel Prize, that he more or less said, no, it's not really, the challenging task is not to identify the equilibrium points, but to identify those equilibrium points that are reasonable. So that, and that basically in game theory, in classical game theory, you have then a whole theory of equilibrium selection. And that was, he's more or less the founding father of the equilibrium selection theory. Basically, the idea is among these many equilibria, which are then economically reasonable. He's, of course, has applied this to economic game theory. But the same problem also arises here, because if the strategies are unconstrained, then quite weird kinds of equilibria can arise.
My question was, how rich do you have to allow your strategy set to be for this to happen? So if you stick to continuity, Can you
No, for example,
have...
in our case, what we can do, what we did, for example, very simple, we just, instead of looking at alpha plus beta times A, we also added here a term like something like plus lambda times A squared. And here plus mu times A squared or something like this. So by just adding then a square term or a third order term and so on. So already if you add here a squared term here, you get many equilibria. If you add a third order term, you get many more equilibria. So you see already even if you just expand then the family of strategies that you allow, that this really leads to a quite a rich potential, quite rich outcomes. But none of these outcomes is more efficient than the negotiation outcome that we see for the very simple strategies, actually. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Let's me now continue, perhaps, and then we can perhaps later come back to that. So I now want to go to a second case study that is also based on the very same behavioral norms of reaction. Therefore, it's important that you asked, because that's again, we again now look at very simple kinds of strategies. And this is some work on the evolution of communication. That's work that I did together with Carlos Botero, and it was already published in 2010 in Evolution. And this is also another interesting kind of game kind of situation, which is in principle a very, very rich, game theoretically very rich field to study. And the basic question is, how do communication systems evolve and which signals convey reliable information? So it's about the evolution of honest communication. And so our the example biological example that inspired Carlos was the so-called badge of status that had been described in these sparrows. So if you take house sparrows, then you see that these house sparrows differ quite a bit. So male house sparrows differ quite a bit in the so-called badges. So these blackish kinds of patches below their beak, and so these are, and it had been shown before, so that there is a correlation between the size of the badge and the physical condition of a bird. So those with a higher physical condition tend to have a larger badge size, and the idea was a bit now that these badges, that they signal the physical condition of the bearer of the badge. But the question is, of course, now how can this system then function? How can it work? In particular, because these badges, they basically consist then of melanin, which is very easy to produce. So these are signals that are not considered to be costly at all. So how can then a signaling system then evolve and be stable if you assume that the signal is not really costly to produce? And in particular, how can it emerge and be stable if the participants in the interactions have conflicting interests? That was the idea behind it. So basically, what we assumed was that house sparrows or different individuals they meet, and then they play a hawk-dove game with each other, but that these sparrows, they differ in fighting ability, where fighting ability is nothing that is inherited, so it's not inheritable property, but it's more something like a randomly assigned property, which is also not unlikely, because for example, in birds, we know that already it makes quite a difference whether a bird is born in a rainy week or in a sunny week. It makes quite a difference for its later physical condition that this bird has. So the birds differ in fighting ability, and this determines then the probability to win an escalated fight. And then they are playing then hawk-dove games. And the question that we ask ourselves now, when should such a bird signal its fighting ability? So should it really signal that, or should it hide this information? We assume that each bird itself has, with some noise, some information about its own condition, on its own fighting ability, but the birds cannot really see the fighting ability of the opponent, and that is only visible via such a signal. The question is, should I more or less then reveal my fighting ability by signal? And the other question is, should I trust the signal sent by my opponent? So when I meet an opponent. And we again made a very simple model. And again, these logistic functions, so that they more or less then characterize our strategies. So we have done we look at the joint evolution of a sender strategy and a receiver strategy. Let's first look at the sender strategy. With this, I mean, so the signaling strategy. And basically, we here in this particular case, we assume so that there is a certain range of fighting abilities from 0 to 1. And then each bird has then to decide on whether to grow a badge and whether to make the badge size depending on the fighting ability. So here's one example where then also a bird with a low fighting ability decides then to grow a relatively large large badge size. But you see here that, and to increase the badge size with its own fighting ability, but it could also go down, it could also be constant, it could be 0, it could be 1. So all the different strategies are possible. And basically here in this case, so the badge size is then governed by two parameters, A and B, where the A and B then more or less tell you how the strategy looks like. And then we also have on the receiver side, so when now a bird is meeting an opponent, then the bird has to decide whether to attack or to retreat, so whether to play hawk or whether to play dove. And in this case, the bird knows more or less its own fighting ability, but it does not know the fighting ability of the rival. It can only judge the badge size of the rival, so the signal that that its rival then produces. And now in this case, we again assume that the attack probability is then depending on own fighting ability and on the signal, which is then the rival's badge size, and that it's governed then by these kinds of strategies. So a strategy that you see here makes a lot of sense, intuitively speaking. Basically what it says then, if I myself have a very high fighting ability, so if I'm in this part of the curve, and if the badge size of my rival is very small, so assuming that larger badges correspond to higher fighting ability, now basically, and if you have an honest signaling system, now then I should always attack when I'm strong and my rival signals that I'm weak, and I should then more play dove otherwise, something like that. But as I said, we did not construct these strategies. These strategies we started from a situation like this, that everybody produced a badge size of 0.5, irrespective of its own quality. And we also started a situation where they all played then the optimal strategy in the absence of any signal that can be calculated for our model. That's basically, this was then the starting point. And then we looked how these parameters that determine the strategies, the A, the B, the C, the D, and the E, how they evolved in the course of in various simulations. And we run 100 simulations. And basically what you see here is not here you see then the mean values of the A's, the B, D, C, C, D, E, F. Now C, D, E, it should be here, I think. So of the different parameters that we saw, and what is shown is not the mean value of the simulations plus minus standard error, it's plus minus standard deviation, which shows very clearly so that the 100 simulations they more or less you see then a very consistent evolution of the average strategies in the population. Here you also see that evolution has not really reached the full equilibrium. So the later plots that I show you, we have then increased the time until really equilibrium was reached. But basically the take-home message here is what you see is that you get a very consistent pattern across the simulations. And if you plot the average values, so if you plot the average A and the B, then you get this kind of signaling strategy. So that basically the average bird behaves in something like this, that at low own quality, it produces a very small batch. At high own quality, it produces a very large batch, and then it increases with own quality. And as a receiver strategy, you also get a very intuitively appealing picture that it says, okay, if I'm strong and my rival signals I'm weak, now then you should attack, and otherwise you should retreat. And there you get then something which looks very much as the evolution of a reliable signal. And so actually that honest signaling has then emerged here in these cases. So this is all very nice, and we were quite happy about that. But then Carlos started to look a little bit more closely into the simulations that he looked at. And then he found something really amazing, namely, whereas the average values of the A, B, C, D, E are very consistent across the simulations, they are not at all consistent within each simulation. Actually, what he found was that the population consisted of completely different communication types. And that's actually what we here indicate here. So, and this happened in all the simulations that we run, that we got 3 different types of individuals. And these 3 different types of individuals, they have systematically different sender strategies and different receiver strategies. On the one hand, we have a certain part of the population which we call aggressive. They always produce, irrespective of how strong they are, they always produce a very, very large batch, and they act in a highly aggressive way. And then we have the rather what we call conservative type. So they produce also a batch, but the batch is much smaller. And they also are much, much less aggressive. And we have a type, but that is somewhere in between, so that we call reactive. So where what more or less is somewhere in the middle and responds a little bit more on what the others are doing. So basically, we find then strong intra-individual variation within the population, and the differences are so strong that we actually call these differences different dialects in the population. Before I go to this, I only want to mention that in the meantime, there are also quite a number of papers on it, and I have not added the most recent ones. There was one review written in 2022, where people came to the conclusion so that the earlier simple picture on the signaling in these house sparrows and song sparrows and other sparrow species, that they are not as simple as one tended to assume, that actually we do indeed find very different signaling and signal interpretation strategies within the same population of sparrows. So what we found in our simulations is perhaps not as strange as it may seem at first sight. One thing that I would like to mention here is one is always in the signaling theory interested in is signaling honest or not. And the interesting thing is here, so we get honest signaling within each of the dialects. So in each of these cases, we see that the signal batch size gets larger with higher fighting ability. And in that sense, it is an honest signal that has been produced. However, across different dialects, there is no, the system is highly dishonest, because if, for example, a green type meets a red type, now then the red type, even if it is a very low fighting ability, produces a larger batch than here an individual of very high fighting ability. So basically across different kinds of dialects, they really misunderstand each other. And from the perspective of, say, conservative individuals, these individuals are really cheating. Although, of course, it's an outcome of evolution and it makes perfect sense here. But the biological conclusions here are that, reliable signals, so of own status, they readily evolve from scratch. But the interesting thing that we also see that the evolution of communication that can very easily leads to coexisting strategies. So we have many other examples where we show actually the same kind of thing. And this is somewhat surprising because one always thought now communication, if it evolves at all, then should then transmit some reliable signals and so, which is somewhat problematic if in this case of the evolved dialects. And we also see that that this explains some passing findings of the field studies, so that I just mentioned before, and that honesty and deceit is a tricky issue when various dialects then coexist. Now comes again my part. This is more for the biologist, but for the game theorist, the interesting thing is now Botero and Weissing, so they have used a very simple kind of strategies. To what extent are their results depending on their choice of model, their choice of the strategy space that they have chosen? And now comes an interesting point in my view. So we had in our case 5 co-evolving parameters. And so n is the number of the parameters of our models in our strategy description. And there we found then 3 different dialects. If we reduce the number of parameters, so if you made the strategies even simpler, then again, if you run many simulations, we got 4 different dialects. So we got here a class, and so we get 4 different classes. These are 2 recently arisen Newtons. So you should not look that much at, well, then you get clusters, but then you get 4. If on the other hand, you enrich the strategy space, so make then the strategies more complicated, now then you see that the diversity, so the polymorphism in the population is reduced. You have 2 dialects, but not the 3 that we found before. And if you make it, so if you go up to 11, 12, 13, and so on, nothing happens until you go up to 21 parameters. So you really need complicated strategies there. Now then, actually, you get a situation where only one language, in a sense, one consistent language, then remained in the population, and all the others they disappeared. Now we found this kind of phenomena again and again in many different kinds of models, not only communication models, and it took us quite a while to understand what is actually going on there. I think in the meantime, we have found, in a sense, an intuitive explanation for it. And basically, I think it has to do with the fact that we restrict ourselves to rather simple strategies. And basically, our explanation goes as follows. Assume now that you have something like a complicated game theoretical problems like this communication problem. And then game theory tells us that optimal strategies are typically, with optimal, I mean a Nash strategy or an ESS or something like that. So that optimal strategies in these kind of contexts tend to be very, very complicated. And this means that when we restrict our strategies to simple strategies, the theoretically optimal strategy is not feasible due to the constraints on the strategy space that we have imposed on it. And therefore, any evolved pattern really leaves then some opportunities unexploited. So they cannot fully cover then all eventualities that can happen. And then that's basically the reason why we get polymorphism, because as long as there are unexploited opportunities, then alternative strategies that focus just on these opportunities, so that are unexploited by, say, the resonance strategies, they can invade and spread. And from this perspective, we arrive at the conclusion that constraints on the strategy space very often are the reason why we then often find polymorphism in the population. So alternative strategies in the same population. So from this perspective, constraints in the strategy space and the polymorphism in the population are 2 sides of the same coin. That's basically our main take-home message from this case study number 2. Are there any questions about this part, on the communication strategies?
If I may,
yeah,
thank you for this, Franjo. So, I mean, I found this quite interesting. So I have one question and one comment. The question was a little, you started answering this, but I was wondering why you have these different dialects. What the mechanism would be. I mean, I guess you now started to explain this a little bit, but
yeah, it's this is one of the things I have hidden a few slides. I can perhaps come back in the discussion to it, because we can. There's actually also some theory about it, and we have some ideas why they can coexist and also how they can emerge. But this is a complicated story. Perhaps
okay, my comment is,
yeah.
So I was wondering whether this is a little bit related to the literature of the evolution of preferences. So in some sense, what you're giving these people is you're giving them strategies that are functions of other things, right?
Yeah.
And it's a little bit as if you were giving them payoffs that are different from fitness. And these functions that you're using are sort of their best responses given their payoffs. And so I was wondering whether one could see it that way, because there in this literature, there is a range from results from some people finding that you can only get efficient outcomes and some people finding that you can get basically anything to be evolutionary stable. So there seems to be a little bit to do with when you said there's more and more complicated strategies, then you can get more and more stable outcomes. Sounds a little bit.
But in this case, I will come back to this. My case study number 4 is about something like the evolution of preferences. So that's I'm very interested in what you said, because I don't know this literature very well, and we can perhaps then later discuss it a bit. But in this particular model, there's nothing like preferences, nothing guides the preference. It's just more that it's a blind kind of process, so that a strategy just says, now I look at my fighting ability and then I just develop a certain signal without any preferences and anything like this in there. It's more the strategies can, of course, basically our strategies all are something like monotonically increasing, monotonically decreasing, and so on. But you could, of course, also have something like an U-shaped response norm of reaction, or an N-shaped response of norm of reaction, or you could have something with many minima and maxima and so on. And there are some examples in the literature where then very simple looking games have then optimal strategies that are very, very, very complicated. And so that if you to really hit the best possible behavior, you really need then something like many parameters to describe it. And but this is very well known in classical game theory. So that complicated, so that even relatively simple games, first of all, can have many equilibria, and many of them look very, very complicated.
Okay, thanks, Sam.
Yeah. Okay. So, but now the next I want to leave a little bit the simple strategies. So what we did until now was more than we looked then more in the more traditional way at how to implement behavior. And then we looked at norms of reaction, so behavioral strategies, and we assumed then more or less that these strategies, so that these norms of reaction here, I've actually then also looked at some that are not given by logistic functions. So you see that there's something like a peak in between or something like a minimum. So for example, these strategies could not all be reproduced by the simple strategies that I looked at, but still these are also very simple looking kinds of behavioral norms of reactions. And they, until now, were then viewed something like as the thing that is selected. Biologists have some problems with that, because biologists think now, if you look in the real world, so then we doubt that something like a strategy itself is then implemented somewhere in the organism. Most probably the organism produces such an input-output relationship, but it produces it by means of a certain kind of a mechanism, and many of these mechanisms are networks. So you may think of gene regulatory networks or neural networks or the hormone network or the immune network or metabolic networks and so on, where then there are some sensors, so some sensory units that then that more or less then sense the environment, and then they more or less transmit this information to some processing units, and then at the end some certain responses emerge from that. And so this is basically now a more mechanistic perspective of evolutionary game theory, where one then more or less tries to make some models where there is a certain mechanism, like this network. This is subject to evolution, and then indirectly by the evolving network, also the strategies evolve. So basically, what I will show you in a moment are some very simple models of neural networks that evolve. So evolving neural networks with relative of a very simple structure at the moment, but they can also become more and more complicated. But basically, the idea is, so we have then some neurons that get then some sensory input, and that then more or less trickle then a level of neurons that are in this something like a processing layer. And in fact, there can be several processing layers that are all linked to each other and so on. It can be relatively complicated, all kind of thing. And so they can actually activate the neuron on the other side, which is then symbolized here by the thick black arrows, or they can repress the next kind of node or something like this, with the symbolized then here by the red connections. And then this processing layer, they can also interact with each other and so on. And in the end, they produce then something like a behavioral output. And what the idea is then the strategy is an input-output relationship. So how does an organism respond to a certain behavioral kind of situation, to a certain kind of behavior relevant situation, which is given by the input? And so which kind of behavior should then be produced? And what is then subject to evolution are all these connections between the neurons. So all, whether this is positive or negative, how strong the connections are, as indicated, this is a very strong one, a thin arrow is a very weak one, and so on. So all these things are then subject to evolution. And in the more sophisticated models that we are looking at, also the architecture of the network can evolve. So we can then get something like duplication of nodes, or that some nodes disappear, or some new connections are forming, and so on. That's basically, but for the moment, for this talk here, I only look at very simple kind of networks with a fixed kind of architecture. And for example, if you would take this there's this communication kind of model, and we actually implemented it also in the network. So then the network could look like this. From the sender perspective, for the evolution of the batch size, we would then have something like one node that takes notice, or that measures the own fighting ability up to some noise. And then there's some processing going on. And then in the end, they produce, then the decision is being taken what the batch size will be. This is more interesting. So in the receiver perspective, you have then two pieces of information: your own fighting ability, the rival's batch size, and then there is some kind of processing involved, and then the aggression level more or less is determined by all these, in a sense, calculations that are taking on then in the network. I will not talk about, so we have, as I said, we have implemented the same model that I showed you before, also in the network, in network configuration, but I would like to give you two other examples of these networks. And I think I will not have time for the second one, but at least let's start with the first one and see how far we get. Now, the first model where we implemented these networks is a paper with Piet van den Berg, who is now an assistant professor at the University of Louvain-la-Neuve in Belgium. And there he looked at iterated Prison's dilemma and the iterated snowdrift game. And we looked at two different implementations of that game. And we looked at a simple case where individuals have a very restrictive memory. So they can only make their strategies depending then on their own previous move and the previous move of their opponent. And that's basically the idea. And this is something that has been investigated in many, many implementations of the iterative Prison's dilemma game. Actually, you have then only 4 memory states. CC means we both cooperated. CD means I cooperated and the other one defected. And here DC means I defected, the other one cooperated. And then DD means that we both defected in the previous round. And therefore you have done 4 different states. And then the pure strategies corresponds then of a list of 4 kinds of decisions, what you would do in different states. So for example, if you always cooperate means irrespective of what happened in the past, you always cooperate. All D means you always defect, and you defect in all situations, irrespective of what happened in the past. Here is the famous tit-for-tat strategy. Basically, you copy the behavior of your opponent. So if the opponent played C, you also play C. If the opponent played D in the previous round, you also play D. The opponent plays C, you play C. And if the opponent played D, you play D. So this is tit-for-tat strategy. And so there are other strategies. This is also a very famous one. It's called win, stay, lose, shift strategy. Basically, it says that in other situations where you got a favorable outcome, namely an outcome where you both cooperated, or where the other one cooperated and you defected, then you stay at your previous strategy. And under the 2 unfavorable outcomes, you changed your strategy. But there are many more, so 16 in total pure strategies. This is, for example, the strategy Grimm that only cooperates after mutual cooperation. Or then there's a strategy called Mr. Nice Guy, which also will show up in a moment, which only defects in case that your cooperation has been exploited by the other. And so there are more of these strategies. Okay, so and then and the interplay of these different strategies has been modeled repeatedly in the literature. And this was started by Novak and Zygmunt in quite famous publications in Nature and Science already quite a while ago. And basically what they did, they ran computer simulations where they had then 4 different gene loci corresponding then to these 4 different states, and where then actually each of these loci there was then 1 cooperation allele and 1 non-cooperation allele that basically then the genotype corresponded then at the list of C's and D's here. So for example, for the tit-for-tat strategy, it would have been a C here, a D here, a C here, and a D there. Or for all cooperated, everything would be C. For all D, everything would be a D, and so on. And so these are then the different genes that are responsible for behavior, and then some mutations can occur and change this behavior. And now we just wanted to see whether then something like a mechanism-based approach would lead to different outcomes. And what we now did is we looked at an extremely simple, on purpose, extremely simple model. Namely, we assumed so that we have a simple network like this. So there are 2 inputs, the own move, and the other is the move of the other one. So these are where you can have only then a C or a D as an input here. And then we had then so some processing going on between so basically this information was transmitted to the processing layer, and then the processing layer then more or less then determined the behavior on whether this was a C or a D. That's basically how it works. So a very, very simple kind of neural network. And in this particular simple kind of game, we had here in the classic traditional implementation 4 genes. And in the mechanism base, we have 6 genes. You see, then there are these 6 different kinds of connections. They could evolve. So positive means, so whenever it's a black arrow, that would have meant that there is a positive allele, and this is a slightly negative allele. This is a strongly negative allele, and so on. So these are the different kinds of values that could evolve. And I should first say that if you take some mechanism, so a neural network like this, that it is possible to realize all 16 pure strategies that there are in this game, in this particular game. So it's not so that this network implementation restricts the strategy space. So we have the same strategy space in both cases. However,
elaborate a little bit on how this mechanism works, because it's new to me. So I'd be curious, what does it mean? Is there color? Does the color mean something, or the arrows? What does it mean?
Yeah, basically the point is in our case, it's just like a calculation. So we have then in our case we have said now say cooperate is +1, and the effect is -1. So you have an input +1 or -1, for example. And then such a thick black arrow means a large number. So the numbers are all constrained between +1 and -1. Say this corresponds to +0.9. And so basically if you get something like a cooperation here in the previous round, you have a +1 times 0.9 gets in 0.9 here, and 0.9 input from this direction here. And then here from this other one, you also get a relatively weak contribution from this as well. And these are just added up in this blue node. And the blue node has another weighing factor here. And then it determines then, and this gives then a contribution to the purple node at the end. It's basically just if you know the weighing factor. So all these arrows correspond to numbers. And if you know all the numbers, you can very easily do all the calculations, all the math, and then get the final outcome. And the final outcome will then offer, if the final outcome is positive, it will cooperate. If the final outcome is negative, it will defect. That's basically how it works. I should have come with an example, perhaps with a worked out example, but I thought that I wouldn't have time for that. Is that a little bit clearer?
That's fine. Yes, that was helpful.
Okay.
Speaking
exactly.
of time, we are close to running out. So depending on how much of a discussion session you want, feel free to.
I will have to drop the final part, the fourth case study, but this one I can complete. It's not really much of a problem. Basically,
five at 9 minutes. So
exactly. So basically, if we just complete this one, basically the question is then, does it really matter? So does the implementation matter? And so what this is basically the implementation that is the classical one in the literature. And this is something that has been published appeared in many articles. Basically what you find that if you then really have these 16 strategies in the population, so that you get then some relatively complicated evolution with some oscillations going on. And the interesting thing is that two of these strategies, they are more or less dominant. So there are periods where this strategy GRIM is predominant. So this is a strategy that only cooperates in case of mutual cooperation. But once in a while, you have then some periods where the strategy Pavlov shows up and really becomes then relatively predominant. And where Pavlov, as I told you, is also one of the standard strategies in this field of prisoner's dilemma kind of reasoning. And if you look over longer periods of time, then you get a certain average level of cooperation that is somewhere in the middle. That's basically what you find there. The interesting thing is that for the implementation, that's basically what we show here, is that the implementation really has a strong effect on the dynamics of the whole kind of the whole thing. So again, we also find a highly dynamic system, so with many ups and downs and so on. Interestingly, what we find is that other strategies are dominating here. So if you take our network implementation, then you have periods where then this blue strategy, which is tit for tat, is then dominating for a while. And then Mr. Nice Guy is a strategy that dominates somewhere in between. But all the other strategies are also occurring somewhere in the background. And what you also see is that the average level of cooperation is also quite different from the average level of cooperation that you have here. I do not want to say that our implementation here is realistic or more realistic and so on. You should see this more as a proof of principle. So proof of principle is in the sense so that the way how you implement strategies, so for example, in simulations, but also I'm convinced in real animals, so that this really makes a difference for the evolutionary dynamics. And this is not only observed in the prisoner's dilemma, we see it in many other situations as well. So, for example, Peter also looked at the iterated snowdrift game. And in this iterated snowdrift game, we could show so that this game, instead, as you may know, in the iterated presence dilemma game, there is no evolutionarily stable strategy. But in the iterated snowdrift game, there are 3 different ESSs, as we could show in our paper. And one of them is very much, so it's a mixed strategy, but which is dominated by a strategy called contrived con-D, whatever it may mean. And so the second one is an ESS where Pavlov is dominating. And the third one is a strategy where there are 3 alternative strategies then at the ESS, and where Mr. Nice Guy is dominating. And these are indicated in 3 different colors. And the interesting thing is that the implementation in the traditional way is really important for, if you run simulations, for the likelihood that each of these different strategies in the end will prevail in the simulation. So if we take the standard implementation in the literature, that would be the left one. So if you would apply this to the iterated snowdrift game, you would always end up with a strategy Mr. Nice Guy. Whereas if you would take the standard kind of implementation that we made in the neural network, we would find out that in about 1/2 of the cases, we would get the con-D strategy, and 1/2 of the simulations, we got the Mr. Nice Guy kind of implementation. However, if we then also change our assumptions on the mutation process, then in both cases, you arrive then also at quite different conclusions. So then all of a sudden, then also the Pavlov strategy shows up. So in other words, what I want to say here is so that the implementation really matters quite a bit for the probability to reach one or the other equilibrium. Or you could also say something about, I don't know, let's not say too much, because in view of the time, I could elaborate on this quite a bit, but let's leave it here and only give you an idea why this is so. So why is it so? So that the implementation really matters for the outcome of these simulations. And the point is there are 2 different reasons why it may matter. So one is that the implementation that might impose constraints on the strategy space. But as I said, this is not the case here, because in our example that we are looking at, all these strategies can also be reached by this, or can be implemented or can be realized by this neural network. But what differs is how the strategies are related to each other. And basically, with related, I mean, how easily can I get by mutation from one strategy to the other? And this is something that is called, in biology, it is related to the idea of the genotype-phenotype mapping. So the question is, how closely are very similar strategies, how closely are they also together in genotype space? So how easy is it to get so from a certain genotype to a certain phenotype? So what you often will find is that large changes in genotype does not affect the strategy at the phenotypic level at all, while small changes at the genotypic level can have huge effects on the strategy that is being produced. And that's something that we show here a bit. In the traditional kind of implementation, you see that you very easily get from all D strategy to the Grimm strategy, very easily from Grimm to tit for tat, from tit for tat to Mr. Nice Guy, Pavlov, and so on. However, if you look more at the network implementation, then you see that from tit for tat, you get very easily to all D. From Grimm, you get very easily to all D, and also from Pavlov, and from Pavlov, you get also easily to all D. For the rest, you have only one important connection here, namely Pavlov can easily mutate into Mr. Nice Guy, but you have all kinds of single-step mutations you can get everywhere, but some of these mutations are much, much more likely. And since all the simulations are very much based then on the interplay of selection and mutation, the mutational process is not irrelevant and quite important for the cause and outcome of evolution. So basically, here the take-home message is that the mechanisms affect the occurrence of behavioral mutations, and they in turn affect the evolutionary dynamics. And that's exactly what I said before. So many mutations have no immediate effect on behavior, but perhaps a large, by accumulating over time, they may have a larger effect. But sometimes mutations of small effect can have a large and unexpected effect on behavior. So I think I should stop here at this moment, because otherwise I had a short fourth case study, but I think I can drop it, although it is about the evolution of preferences. We can later perhaps talk a little bit about it.
All right, so I'm going to stop the recording, and we're going to have a quick discussion session.
Yeah. Should I then unshare my screen?
Up to you.